Welcome to this session on Azure Stack. I'm Bradley Bartz.
Hi, this is Filippo Seracini.
And we're with the Azure Stack engineering team, the team bringing you Azure Stack. And today, we're going to talk about how to understand or think about Azure Stack from the perspective of the customer. You know, Azure Stack's kind of interesting. It's this cloud platform, it's Azure, but there's lots of ways to think about Azure. You can bring the IT lens, you can talk about the, what does it mean from an IT and operator perspective? You can talk about what about the developer, what can I do with it? But why? Why are customers wanting to use Stack? What are the problems that they're trying to solve, and why are those problems so important? And why can't they do those today? That's what we're going to explore a little bit when we talk about Azure Stack and what it's used for and how to fit Azure Stack into your organization. So to get started with, it's kind of useful to think about what Azure Stack is for and what it's not for. For example, it is not a virtualization replacement. So it's not to go out and replace your virtualization strategy in your data center. That's not what it's for. What it is for is building a consistent hybrid cloud platform.
As a matter of fact, it's not only a way to build the hybrid platform, it's the first hybrid platform in the market, it's also the only one, the only really, truly hybrid platform. Also what it is that it's a integrated system. That means that you cannot build it yourself using some of the servers that you have in your data center. It's not like a DIY, do-it-yourself solution. It's a solution that comes as an integrated solution. It's an integrated system with hardware and software together, and we have developed with our hardware partners.
So what does that mean? So remember, from an IT perspective, we're used to going out and buying all the Legos, building up the kind of systems we want. I'm going to go out, build my disks, my storage systems. I'm going to build out my compute. I'm going to go get my network infrastructure. I'm going to go build out my cloud infra. That's not what Stack is. It's not one of those. So if that's the problem, if you're trying to figure out how to better manage your storage systems, how to better manage your infrastructure, I want to better manage my network routers and my edge, that's not Stack. That's not what it's for. It is this integrated system. It is an Azure appliance, a device that you deploy in your data center. Well, if it doesn't manage my data center, if it's not helping me manage the rest of my data center, why would I deploy that device there? What's it for? That's what we're going to find out. What it's not is a system that you statically deploy once, fire and forget. Okay? It's not something that you just put in there, got it up and going, great, I can now walk away. Does Azure do that? What happens in the cloud when we build Azure? It's constantly churning, constantly updating. It's happening in real time.
How often do you guys think Azure updates itself? Just number. Multiple times a day. So that's the pace that we have to keep with Azure Stack. I mean, we cannot let customers fall behind months and months and months. Because Azure Stack is all about the consistency, bringing Azure to your data center so that you have an Azure a consistent instance inside your data center. So if you fall behind, if you stay behind with the updates, the promise of the consistency will fall apart. That's why it's very important that you will walk with us with the updates, and you take the updates as they come with Azure Stack.
So there's a system that's constantly going to be rolling forward like that. Okay, here's an interesting one. Here's the case. I can't tell you how many shops, companies I've gone and met with, where they say, okay, you're from Microsoft, right? All right, here's my Windows guys. They do the Windows development, they're on server. Oh yeah, and they're using Azure too. Oh, my Linux guys, they're over here. They do all the OpenStack work, they do the Linux, and they're over here on AWS. So there's this like siloed workloads. They build one class of applications over here, another class of applications over there. Well, it turns out in the cloud, that's not how it's really divided. Matter of fact, one of our fastest growing workloads is on Linux in Azure, and on Linux platforms like Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry and Azure today, cloud is about running a variety of workloads. And that actually is true of Azure Stack as well. So Azure Stack is not a Windows-only cloud. That's not what it's for. It is, in fact, a cross-platform hybrid cloud, bringing you the same capabilities for building applications that we see in Azure. So, as we think about it, if we're not solving an IT problem, like who buys Azure Stack and what are they buying it for, and how do you come to a decision about acquiring a stack? It's super important to know why you want one. Who's the customer? Who's actually going to be running something on Stack, and why are they running it? For example, in the data center today, one of the common scenarios might be, hey, I just want to lift and shift a bunch of my existing workloads, put them on Stack, and walk away. Is that a good use case for Stack?
No, it's not. And believe it or not, this is one of the most common questions we get, even downstairs at the booth at the expo. Even yesterday, I got asked many, many times, is that the scenario? I have my VMware deployment. Can I lift and shift the VM and bring it to Azure Stack? And that's actually not a good idea, because you don't get the benefit of the cloud. If you just move you can maybe be successful in lifting and shifting to Azure Stack, but you don't get the benefit of Azure Stack. You get this powerful machine, and you're just going with the first gear. It's not useful, because you're not leveraging the advanced PaaS capabilities that Azure Stack brings inside your data center. You're not leveraging the IaaS capabilities that brings inside your data center.
Now, wait a minute. But as a company, we're building this new application. We're building it in Azure. We've got this great solution we've been building out in Azure, but I just took a new customer, and they're requiring me to keep my data from my application on-premise. Can I do that with Azure Stack?
That one you can do, because at that point, what you can do, you can re-architect your application on-prem to use cloud technologies, meaning PaaS and IaaS technologies, and running them inside your data center. So you have data locality, you have control of your infrastructure, you have control of who have access to what, and so on and so forth.
What if I haven't even started to use Azure yet, but I know I'm going to, and I want to start getting ready to modernize my applications? Can I use Stack for that?
Absolutely. There's actually a very common scenario. We have a lot of customers. They have legacy applications. They have applications running on mainframes. Think of like the financial industry, or old Oracle databases and big, heavy applications. And for them, doing the jump from the on-prem world all the way to the public cloud is too big. So they see Azure Stack as an incremental way for them to modernize their application, to modernize their data centers, and so they can incrementally move to cloud technologies within their data center, and then if and when they will be ready, they will also be able to leverage the public cloud technology in the public cloud.
Both Filippo and I have been in a number of customer engagements. We do these kind of executive briefings. We bring in and meet teams, and an interesting thing happens when we're talking to a customer. If we're sitting in a room, and they said, oh, this is going to be a data center story, so we're going to send our IT team. Send the IT team in. Let's go learn about Azure Stack and figure out how we're going to use it. And we start presenting Azure Stack, and they go, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure I understand why I need that. It's not helping me solve my existing challenges that I have in the IT department. Why do I need this? What I found fascinating is we've had a number of these customer engagements. The most productive engagements we've had are when the line of business stakeholder comes to the meeting, when the developer comes to the meeting, and the IT department all come to the same meeting to talk about Azure Stack. Because here's what happens. We start explaining the capabilities, and the IT guy is kind of, well, it sounds kind of interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it's doing yet. And all of a sudden, the line of business guy goes, wait a minute. We're expanding in a new market. I need to make sure data is resilient, but I want to take an asset over here that I'm running over in Azure, and I want to be able to redeploy it there in this new to grow my business. And the developer's going, wait a minute, I can do that if it has this capabilities, but we don't have anywhere to run it because I need to either rewrite my application or I need some way to take advantage of the capabilities I would have had in Azure if Azure would have been available. And the IT guy starts to go, oh, wait a minute, I know how I can meet your requirements now by shipping Azure Stack into that geography. So the most productive conversations around Azure Stack, and when you get all the stakeholders involved to have a discussion about what's the problem you're trying to solve, where is it going, what are you going to run on it, and once you get those stakeholders together and understand the problem, then you can kind of think about and tune an Azure Stack deployment to meet those requirements. So it's a multi-stakeholder conversation. And that's what this diagram is really depicting. It's important to make sure that you understand the use cases that you have in your company and your business and your stakeholders for what the problem they're trying to solve as a business. And you also want to know what the hybrid application patterns that they're trying to build. What are the app patterns that they want to deploy? Then based on that, you start thinking about sizing. Well, I mean, I'm building a cloud application, right? When I build it in Azure, I don't think about sizing. I just go use as much as I want. Can I do that with Stack?
Well, not quite, because in the public cloud, you have this sort of like abstraction where the capacity of the public cloud runs at a hyperscale, so you sort of have this infinite capacity. When you run in your data center, you have to keep in mind that you have a limited capacity. Just to give you an idea, if you haven't heard this week yet, Azure Stack goes from 4 servers all the way up to 12. That's the current maximum capacity. It's something we'll expand in the future, but this is where we are right now. So obviously, if you need to have a very a very heavy deployment, for nodes maybe not enough. If you're already 50% of the capacity utilization, that also may be not enough if you want to deploy additional workloads. So the capacity, in the case of Azure Stack, is actually a very important conversation that you need to have.
And here's another thing to think about. We're getting to the point where we're pretty good at sizing, my SharePoint farm or my Exchange system I got to go out and build. But what we're really talking about here are kind of these modern line of business applications that are being developed for the cloud. There's not a standard checklist I can go down to figure out the sizing of my new modern cloud application that I'm using for a financial trading system up in the cloud. I'm going to have to get that sizing information from the developers who built that. I'm going to have a conversation about them, about how they built that application, understand what they need from a capacity for this cloud application, to start thinking about what does that mean. Another scenario you want to think about, for example, that comes up, we have lots of customers today that would love to use Azure, go out and use it, but they have air-gapped deployments. Air-gapped meaning there's no internet connectivity. It is on a submarine. It's in the bottom of a mine shaft. It's somewhere where it's like off-grid. You might want to know that because that's going to affect how you're going to set up Stack. So you need to know what's the use case for it, what's it being intended for, and how am I going to define that. So you need to collect all this information. Marketplace? Why would Marketplace be there?
Well, Azure Stack, again, as we keep saying, is Azure inside your data center. So as you know, Azure has a huge marketplace with a lot of offering. The same capabilities now are available inside Azure Stack because we have marketplace syndication. So you can actually go in Azure Stack inside the portal and decide which marketplace item to syndicate with Azure. And you can download it and offer it to your customers.
So let's do a quick show of hands in this audience today. How many are IT? A lot of IT. How many are developers? Okay?
A few.
You guys, you developers, you're pretty important. You're going to be sending the requirements to your IT guys on what you're actually going to need. Now wait, how many in this room are kind of the business stakeholders, the business owners in your company? One over here, a couple over there. You guys are actually critical too in this whole equation because you're the ones coming up with the requirements why you might need Azure Stack. What is the actual need for the scenario? And that's what this is all about. It's about having that conversation. So let's go ahead and look at the next.
So as Bradley mentioned, the first thing you have to start is from the use case. What is that you're trying to achieve? What is your business problem? What is your application problem? What is your service you want to offer to your customers? What are the scenarios where you want to deploy your application? And so on and so forth. So you need to understand really deeply what are your use cases and what kind of dependencies your use cases, your scenarios have, so that you can understand what kind of deployment of Azure Stack, if, first of all, you need Azure Stack, or you can directly go to the public cloud, or maybe you just need a basic virtualization. and also what kind of resources, what kind of deployment, so on and so forth. So starting from the use cases, and here is really important when to have that conversation that Bradley was talking about, where you put the IT system, you put the developers, and you put the business owners together in a room so that you can really get this holistic picture of why you're trying to get with Azure, what you're trying to get with Azure Stack.
Here's another thing to think about. And the folks that are in an enterprise corporate environment today, how many of you can move 100% of your assets into the public cloud? Wow, I don't even see one. Okay, one.
All right.
Usually there's one or two that say, yeah, I'm all in. I can get it all there. Okay. How many of you can move a subset of your catalog into the public cloud?
More hands.
More hands. Okay. Once you're in that situation, everybody that just raised your hand, once you're in the situation where you start to move a subset of your applications into the public cloud, or you start doing that greenfield cloud development, start modernizing your fleet, they start to build on those PaaS services and start to embrace the cloud. Once you're in the world where you're dabbling in the cloud for some of it and keeping some of it inside your corporate firewalls, you now have a new problem that you didn't have before. That problem is really around people, processes, and artifacts. Once you're in that scenario, now what do you have? I already talked about having a Windows team, then you had your kind of your open source team, your Linux guys over here, and then what do you have? Your cloud team? Your cloud team knows how to do everything in the cloud, and they're moving forward. They're embracing all the latest agile technologies. They're using Jenkins. They might be using Cloud Foundry, and they're using all the latest cloud capabilities, functions, and serverless computing. And they've moved on, but the guys on premise don't know that. But now you're modernizing your fleet. Do they not get to modernize their fleet? What happens if you now need to share assets between what's running in the cloud and something that's running in premise? How are you going to do that? So once you're in the scenario where part of your estate is moving to the cloud, you now have a problem about domain expertise. How do you leverage that domain expertise? Azure Stack can help you start to look at that problem of leveraging that Azure domain expertise that you're acquiring for your estate, whether it's running in the public cloud or running inside your walled garden. And that's part of this conversation that you want to have. You want to start talking about, am I moving some of my assets to the cloud? What assets? What do they need? Do they actually come back on premise as well? Or are some of them going to run in both? To start having that, get these patterns identified. Identify the services that you're going to use, the resources that you need. And then last but not least on here, with that information, what are we going to do?
We start looking into the size of the deployment of the Azure Stack instance that you will need. And today we'll give you also a lot of information on the patterns. And later this week there will be a session with our colleague Spencer that will actually go and help you doing the math on how to understand, how to figure out how much capacity do you need. So don't miss that presentation, and we'll give you a pointer at the end.
So our team embarked on a pretty amazing process the last couple of years. It was called our customer obsession. And the purpose of this exercise was to find out, why do people want Azure on their premises? Like, why can't they just use Azure? What are they trying to accomplish? What are the use cases? And this was a in-depth customer immersion where we did these call downs. We ran a process. Have you ever heard of Moneyball? People heard of Moneyball? It's a kind of a survey questioning process for getting customer insights. We ran this pretty extensive program, and we called hundreds of customers and went through their scenarios.
Any of you here in the room that talked with us during these calls?
Was anybody on those calls in this room? Okay.
No? All right.
These weren't leading. They weren't like, hey, we've built this great solution. We think it'll solve this problem. Does this meet your needs? That's not what the exercise goes with. The exercise is, what are you trying to do? What's the problem and use case you're trying to solve? You were on many of those calls.
Absolutely. And basically, we, as Bradley said, we talk with a lot of customers. We ran surveys. We reach out, sometimes in person, sometimes with the phone. So we really scout, we can say the globe, talking with customers. And by talking with all of these customers, a series of patterns of scenarios start coming out. And it's what you see here. So the three main scenarios where customers are looking at having Azure but not being able to go to Azure. So they wanted the cloud technology the Azure offers, but they couldn't go to the public cloud for different reasons. And the three main use cases we found are these three. So the first one are for those customers that would love to go to the public cloud, but simply cannot. Physically, they cannot. Because maybe they are deploying in some remote location where there is no connectivity, or where the connectivity is very unstable or very slow. Therefore, they can't leverage a public cloud because the bandwidth is too small or unstable. So that's what we call the edge and disconnected scenario. The second one are for those customers, and I bet there are a lot of you here, they are in like financial industry, healthcare, government, military, where they would like to use the public cloud technologies, but they cannot because they have regulations, either external regulations, so like compliance standards, or internal regulation by the company, by the department, and so on and so forth. They don't allow them to put the data on the public cloud, like PII data, healthcare data, and so on and so forth. So those are what we call the cloud that meets every regulation. And the third one are those customers. They are sort of like stuck in the past with like legacy applications, and they want to sort of modernize their application set. But as I mentioned earlier, the jump from going from the mainframe or from legacy application to use Azure Functions or serverless computing or containers is so big that they cannot figure out how to handle, and the switch is too big, and the risk associated with it are too high. Therefore, they want a sort of like a middle step. They help them moving forward, embracing these new technologies while maintaining the control. So that's the third scenario you see here, where for the modernization of your applications. So those are really what our customer told us across these hundreds of customer calls and a customer interaction we had in the last 3 years. And that's exactly what we designed Azure Stack for. Azure Stack, the main reason why you want Azure Stack is if you fall in one of these three categories.
You know, there was something that was kind of interesting through these calls. One of the things we learned, these first two categories, the edge and disconnected and the cloud applications that meet every regulation, we'll go into that. But the vast majority of customers that were in that category were customers that were already using Azure. These were Azure customers that already were using Azure, built Azure solutions. They were in production with an Azure-based solution. That's what they were doing. And now they had scenarios as their businesses grew that required them to now run and have a way to deliver capability outside of where Azure physically existed. And they were challenged to get that functionality out there. And we'll go through some of these use cases. Let's go ahead and click in.
So the edge and disconnected scenarios.
In edge and disconnected, these almost predominantly were Azure solutions. Matter of fact, one I'll talk about is the center that I'll talk about is in the manufacturing, factory floor scenarios. This is typically, we often heard of this in the IoT space. So in these scenarios, we had customers that were working on IoT solutions. They're aggregating a lot of data from on-premise solutions, bringing those up in the cloud, doing data processing and analytics. But in many of these customers, they were now having to go and build a factory floor where they didn't have good, reliable connectivity back to the public cloud. Or they were deploying in a mine shaft, like Schlumberger or an oil and gas industry. Or there's an oil rig where they're out in the middle of the ocean and they have spotty connection. But they're trying to figure out how to take advantage, to leverage that Azure capability they were building. How do I still run that kind of system and infrastructure that I was at? Now, here's how it kind of went. It was interesting. We had an IoT summit a while back, and we had a lot of the companies that are heavily invested in IoT scenarios all come in and kind of talk to the IoT teams, and Azure Stack was part of this and had a discussion about what their use cases were. And when we started with many of these customers, we asked them, well, how much, because now, is anybody in this room doing anything with IoT? Not yet. It's a couple? Okay. IoT, it turns out there's a lot of technologies involved in IoT. It's not just one or two. There's a lot of technologies, both from Microsoft and open source solutions, that come together to constitute an IoT solution. Whether you're doing stream analytics, you're doing machine learning, you're doing event aggregation, there's a ton of data that needs to come together. So we asked these guys, well, how much of that IoT surface area, how many of those IoT technologies do you need in Stack to meet your scenario? Well, we need them all. Really? That's a lot. That's a lot of technologies, and you want them all to run on one of these 4, 8, or 12 node stacks? Well, yeah. Okay, well, that's going to take a while. We don't have all those IoT technologies for distribution to Stack yet, and they probably won't fit. There's going to be some space requirements to make that happen. So we had to push back a little bit, and we said, well, what do you really need? What's the real use case? What's the problem you're trying to solve? By and large, most of them came back with this answer. We're more than, actually, I don't need the machine learning in Stack. I don't need to do in the IoT world, there's something called model development, where you basically take a bunch of data, you do some machine learning on that, and you develop a model, an operational model based on that data that you can then score and operationalize on a factory floor, on a mine, in a mine shaft, on an oil rig, for basically how you monitor the equipment at that location and do kind of detection of failure. So it turns out, by and large, most of them said, you know what, I can do all my model development in the cloud where I have infinite capacity, but what I actually need to do on my remote oil rig, on my mine shaft, on my factory floor down in Argentina somewhere, what I actually need to do is just score the data. I need to operationalize it as it's running. Oh, wait, that's a much smaller problem. That actually makes sense. That you can do with Stack. So think about already, you're now having a conversation just in that space between a customer, what's the real use case, what's the problem they're trying to solve, and understand the hybrid nature, what makes sense to run in Azure and what makes sense to run in Stack, and now we have an imminently doable solution. And that's how those conversations go. And so that's what we did around the manufacturing, oil and gas, and IoT space. And similar with the shipping.
Yeah, we talked with one of the largest cruise line companies in the world. And what they're doing, they actually have a huge Azure customer. But what they do today is that they collect a lot of data, tons of data, while they're out at sea. And when they are out at sea, they don't have connectivity, unless they have in some areas where they can be reached by satellite connectivity, but which in the case is very expensive and with extremely low bandwidth. So what they do is basically they collect the data, think of like the route, engine numbers, and how the engine is working, and how the ship is working and operating, and so on and so forth. And they're collecting all this data. And then when they get to port, they basically connect to the mainland, also in terms of internet connection, and they upload this massive amount of data to the public cloud, to Azure. And there they do all the optimization, they do all this hyperscale data analysis, not only for the ship, but for the entire fleet. So for the next trip, they will be able to basically improve their numbers, their efficiency. So what they want to do with Azure Stack now is to do that optimization in real time on the ship while the ship is out at sea. Because if they don't need to upload all the data to the public cloud, they can already do the optimization of the ship on real time. And they will do the fleet optimization once they come back to port. So see, the same application, now they develop once, but they can deploy in 2 different areas. One is the public cloud, one is on board, on the ship, and they don't have to change it. But still, they get a lot of the benefit without having to do much coding, recoding, having 2 code platforms, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the advantages the Azure Stack can bring to them, and it's the only platform that can do that.
This next slide is pretty interesting. This is really about regulated industries. So we found a number of customers that were in the financial sector, healthcare sector, and government sector, where they were actually under regulatory constraints or policies that they had within their company that prohibited the use of some of their applications in the public cloud, whether it be a data sovereignty constraint, whether it be an intellectual property concern, whether it be a geographic or geopolitical concern. So there are a number of customers in this category interestingly enough, a couple of them actually had an Azure-based solution. As a matter of fact, you saw one today in Scott Guthrie's keynote, where he talked about Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young was in this category, and Ernst & Young built a financial application they use and operate in Azure today. And as they were growing and expanding their business, they were now onboarding new customers from geographies around the world where those customers were prevented by their government from using their solution in the public cloud. So they couldn't actually go in and use their platform. And so how do I grow? How do I expand my business? Because they want to onboard these customers. They have a good solution. The customer wants it. They're hungry for the solution. And they want to deliver the solution. They have an interesting problem. Once you're in that situation, I've invested in the cloud. I've built an elastic, scalable platform. How do I meet? Now, I could go back. I could reverse engineer my app, go back to the old school 3-tier application, go to running it on servers again, build that app and deploy it. But now I've got 2 code bases, 2 different, I've got a mess. How do I get my application in this other environment? Enter Azure Stack. Azure Stack now is a solution that they can look at for how to deploy their financial solution that they built in Azure into these other geographies that they would otherwise be unable to address. This last category was kind of interesting. In this category, this really falls in the lines of, you know, that whole cloud thing, I know I'm going to get there. I know that's happening and I want to start using it, but not quite today. I'm not quite ready, and I'm not sure what portion of my estate's going to move. So, for example, one was a mass transit, a government agency that runs mass transit. So here they run all the buses, the trains, the ferries, all the mass transit of the thing. Guess what? It's sitting on a mainframe. It's a mainframe app running. It runs well. Runs pretty good. All the data's there, serving their customers. But you know, their customers call them, hey, we want mobile. We want to integrate with the social networking. We want to get and integrate with weather and know the weather conditions on the routes. We want a modern information system. We want to look at this like I do anything else on the internet. Why is it so dated and out of date? So the company was struggling with how do they modernize the management of their mass transit system. And they came to us, and this isn't Microsoft going in and pitching a solution for them. They actually came to us and go, you know what? We think Azure Stack would be a perfect fit for us. What? Okay. How's that? What do you mean? Are you going to move your mainframe app over to Azure Stack? What are you talking about? No. We're going to keep it on the mainframe. Look, we still got to get a lot of years of use out of this thing. The app's there. It works. We're not going to touch it. But what I want to do, and this is them talking to us, what they wanted to do was basically put the controllers on Stack that would know how to talk to the mainframe, and then put all the modern cloud interfaces. They would put the mobile apps, the mobile interfaces on top of Azure Stack. They would do the modernization of their web front end on Azure Stack. They would integrate with social networking using all the latest business-to-business logic on Azure. They would use Azure Stack as a modern front end to their mainframe data. So now as far as the customer is concerned, it would look just like the latest applications coming from Silicon Valley or whatever. They would get the latest, or Redmond, the latest cloud solution out there for what's happening in the world. And that's why they were looking at Stack, is giving that cloud facade on top of a legacy system. And that was pretty compelling. Actually, it was pretty exciting once we understood what they were trying to do. We saw several customers in this category. That's why they were looking at deploying Stack. So that was an interesting use case.
So now we gave you an overview of all the 3 main use cases or scenarios for which we design Azure Stack. So let's now dig into one of those, and I will actually show you one application, a real application we created that follows and meets the requirement for one of these use cases, and so that we can also describe the architecture and so on and so forth. So this is basically we are going to look into the cloud application meets every regulation. So if you're in the financial industry, healthcare, government, military, or any other regulated industry, you probably fall into this. You want to talk about the problem?
Yeah, this was pretty fun. So this came from a real customer. They're in the healthcare industry. They have a healthcare app. Now, The way it works here in the US with our healthcare insurance is that usually there's a period called open enrollment. During open enrollment, you get a lot of demand. You just flood the system. Everyone's signing up. Remember the Affordable Healthcare app. All the demand comes in, it crashed. But this wasn't that. It wasn't the Affordable Healthcare team or anything like that, but it's a similar scenario. It's the scenario where you get this load comes in during open enrollment. It's usually a month long. But then the rest of the year, their systems were basically dormant, not getting a lot of traffic, not much. And what they would normally have to do is provide a lot of capacity on premise to handle that, and the rest of the year that capacity is sitting dormant or getting reutilized for other things that they have to evict when it's time for open enrollment the next year. Now in that scenario, they also had corporate policy that mandated all of the personal identifying information stay inside their corporate environment. It had to stay on premise. That's what they required. They needed that data to stay. So they were coming to us, how can we solve that problem? What does that look like? And so in this scenario, what they were looking for is, can we do this? Is it possible to do this in a hybrid manner? Can I borrow Azure capacity when I need it during open enrollment and then scale it back and forget about it when it's the rest of the year? That's kind of the question they're coming to us and asking about. Again, I've got to know the use case.
And so that's exactly what we help them achieving with sort of this application pattern. So what they wanted is basically the ability to do bursting to the public cloud during those moments of peak where the load was very high, while at the same time maintaining the control of the data, the PII data on-prem, because again, they were under regulation. So what we did is basically we helped them creating this combination of the application on-prem, and then we put in front of the application a load balancer and a trigger with Azure Functions. A trigger that will basically measure the incoming flow of traffic and flip the load balancer between the private cloud on Azure Stack and the public cloud on Azure, depending when the incoming requests were above a certain threshold. But what we also did is basically the front end, so that their users could have a response from the website, would move to the public cloud, because in a completely transparent way, because again, same application, completely consistent API, so you just move it up through a CI/CD pipeline. So the front end will move to the public cloud, scale up as much as needed, but the front end with the database and so on and so forth will stay on-prem. So they could meet their PII requirements while at the same time meeting this spike in their data, in their request from their customers. And so that's sort of the application that we're able to do thanks to Azure Stack. And they didn't have to create two different applications and move in two different code bases, but would just move the application up and down as needed based on the Azure functions, a load balancer, and other Azure capabilities that are now available in Azure Stack.
Now think about this for just a second. That scenario couldn't be met with just IT alone. IT wasn't like auto-magically making the burst happen in Azure seamlessly happening. This actually required the application. This was a hybrid app, an app designed for this scenario, in conjunction with IT to deliver it. So if we look at the next slide, in the application architecture, you can see that part of the application is actually going to live in Azure, and part of the application is going to live in Stack. Okay, it's a hybrid app by definition. And so what IT is really managing is, or at least providing the infrastructure for, is what's in the orange box, because that's what's running inside the data center. The stuff in the blue box on the top is all running in Azure, and the application is straddling those cloud boundaries dynamically based on load. And so this is a joint effort. So as we start to go into this hybrid world, you're going to see this pattern come up over and over again, where these hybrid applications are being designed to take advantage of infrastructure that exists across cloud boundaries, across infrastructure that's running on-premise and infrastructure that's running in the cloud. And that's a conversation that needs to be had to understand, what does that look like? How is it targeted? In this case, it was critically important that the application tier be identical at all times, because you couldn't have the application tier in the Azure public cloud not match it in Azure Stack. So they were using consistent developer tools, CI/CD pipelines, to ensure those were always in sync. The database always existed on premise. And this allowed them to have a scenario where they would dynamically burst into the cloud, scaling out with as much capacity they needed during open enrollment, and then collapse it back down to nothing with no charge after open enrollment. And the rest of the year, all the traffic would be routed inside the on-premise infrastructure. So those are the kind of patterns we're seeing customers develop over and over again for a modern cloud application that's hybrid in nature. So there's a lot of questions that need to be asked when you're talking to a customer, a user. You want to find out, what resources do you need? How are you planning to, one, make sure you know the problem they're trying to solve. What's the problem and use case they're going after? Once you know that, what resources do they need to solve those problems? What Windows Server images do they need? Are they running Linux? What Linux images do they need? What are they going after? Are they going to be using traffic managers? Is this a hybrid app or a siloed app? You want to get that information. We want to know what we're building. You want to know whether you're going to, in this case, this application was built. Remember, one of the things you get with Azure Stack is you're getting infrastructure as code. So those applications can actually provision and deploy their infrastructure as part of the app. In this case, there's a site-to-site network tunnel that's connecting the portion in Azure with the portion in Stack. That's being provisioned as part of the application. But that might have to go through an edge device that IT might have to help facilitate. Then you're going to have a set of Azure services. Another thing you need to think about, Azure Stack, think of it as like the core cloud operating system. It's this modern cloud compute layer that I then add Azure services to it as needed. So it doesn't come with all the Azure services. You add those to it. So in this case, when you're doing an Azure Stack deployment, you might ask, well, do you actually need those Azure services? Which one? Because they're going to take up some capacity in Stack. So you need to have that conversation. In this case, this app did not need app services. Go back. It did not need app services. So that wouldn't have to be deployed in that Azure Stack environment. Next question. There's a lot of other Azure services. So you kind of, they might, remember I was talking about many of our customers start with an Azure-based application that they then want to move into another geography. Remember the Ernst & Young app, or in this case, the shipping company that needed to move a subset of their application onto the ship side. One of the things that's asked is, well, what Azure services are they dependent on? Now, not all Azure services are available for Stack yet. Okay? They're not there. But that doesn't mean that the apps can't move. Azure services are usually multi-tenanted services over some other technology. I'll give you an example. In Azure, our Redis cache service basically provides Redis cache as a service and provisions it. I don't yet have Redis cache available as a service within Azure Stack. But we do have Redis cache available as an IaaS workload that runs on top of infrastructure. It could be provided through the marketplace. So their app can still run. Redis cache is available, but not as a service. This is a good part of kind of assessing how are we going to meet the requirements for that application. Is it available on the service? Does it require a service? Is the service available in Stack? If the service isn't, is there an alternative that's compatible with the service they would have been using in Stack? And in many cases, the answer to that is yes. So you go through that kind of analysis, and then you look, they might be using other technologies. For example, many of our customers are actually using things like Kubernetes, Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which was just announced today as being available for Azure Stack. These technologies are there and available. If we go to the next slide, you'll see why. Azure Stack today is working with our Azure ecosystem, our partners that are building solutions for distribution to Azure. Now, in Azure, we have a huge marketplace with all of our ISVs. Now, when you get Azure Stack, you also have a marketplace of what can be provisioned by your application developers, your business owners, the people that are going and deploying and creating applications on Azure Stack. They're doing those through a marketplace. But it starts out empty. There's nothing in it. So you have to ask the question, what are you going to put in your marketplace? Well, that depends on what your customers' needs are. So you're going to have to find out. And then we provide a syndication feed of all the Azure Marketplace items that have been certified and ready for deployment to Stack. And then as an operator of Stack, you can basically just check the ones you want, and they'll automatically hydrate down and populate it in the Azure Stack environment that you're running. So you want to know that. Which of these technologies among the hundreds that are there do your customers actually need and require?
So what we showed earlier was one of the application pattern that we envisioned, that we defined, we created for Azure Stack. But that's just one of the many. So now we'll just walk through fairly quickly because we are out of time, but I just want to give you an idea of all the capabilities Azure Stack gives you when you put in your data center. So what you see here is what we call the dev and test in one cloud. So for example, you can have your development team running on Azure so that when they don't have any requirement, for example, for data locality, but then the production environment is on-prem. You can also do the other way around. You can have your production environment on-prem, and then you deploy your dev and test on-prem and your production environment on Azure if you need the larger scale. The other one is local secrets. That's very common in the financial industry, where they want to maintain and retain the control of the keys, the encryption keys. So there are solutions that it's a way, basically, you use the public cloud while you maintain the control of the keys because you store your keys on-prem. So your application that runs on the public cloud comes and picks up the key from your on-prem solution and then unlocks your application in the public cloud, but you always maintain the control of the keys. The stage data analytics, that's similar to the one I described for the cruise line. So what they do is basically, they do part of the data analysis on-prem, and then they send only the aggregated data to the public cloud. So that saves, for example, bandwidth. It allows you to do some real-time computation while you're on-prem, and then you can do the hyperscale aggregation on the public cloud. So for example, in that case was the fleet optimization. Another one is Azure as a Secure Edge. You use Azure and all the Azure security features to basically expand and enhance your on-prem solution. So think of a security center, think of other OMS. All of those solutions, they allow you to basically monitor and protect your on-prem workloads running on top of Azure Stack with the help, with the enhanced protection of the public cloud. Geo-distributed applications. That's very similar to the one that Bradley described, where we basically will burst to the public cloud. You can think of the similar scenario where you have the same application replicated across the world for international companies or global companies that deploy in Azure or in a combination of Azure and Azure Stack, depending on what kind of regulation they have to meet, what kind of requirements they have, what kind of bandwidth they have in a specific country or the specific region. So thanks to the traffic manager and other cloud technologies, they can actually have this complete flexibility between the public and private cloud globally. So as we said, it's all about choosing the right solution. It's all about choosing why you need Azure Stack. So you have to be careful about the purpose. You have to decide whether you want to be connected or disconnected, what kind of identity provider you need to have, because that has implications. So in the case of Azure Stack, there are two identity providers, Azure Active Directory and Active Directory on-prem via ADFS. What kind of workloads you want to deploy on top, what kind of capacity you need for your workloads, and so on and so forth. So all of these requirements, all of this discussion are very important for you to understand and to have. And that's why it's very important that you put in the same room your IT administrators, your developers, and your business owners, so that together you can define these requirements, understand what you need, so you can understand what kind of Azure Stack combination you may need, and what kind of specifically to Azure Stack, what kind of deployment of Azure Stack you need. So again, in summary, keep this table in mind, start from the use cases, what is that you're trying to achieve, and then walk down. So don't start from the infrastructure, start from the use cases, start from your business targets, and then from there, basically decline all the rest and understand all that you need from your infrastructure. So this is really important. This is what we have seen with our customers, our initial customers with Azure Stack, those that have been successful, that's what the process that they follow to understand what kind of Azure Stack deployment, what kind of Azure Stack instance they need in their data centers. So last slide. This is just the Azure Stack is a huge investment from Microsoft. It's a massive bet. As you can see, we have something like 28, 30 different sessions here at Ignite. So we are up there. So you have a lot of content in case you want to know more about Azure Stack. And I strongly recommend this one here, as I mentioned earlier, from Spencer Shepler. He's one of the architects for Azure Stack, and he will go into the detail on how to do the sizing, what math, and how you can understand what kind of sizing capacity you need for your application with Azure Stack. So I strongly recommend, if you are interested in understanding how to compute that, to attend the session.
All right.
So with that, thanks a lot for your time. Sorry we went a few minutes over time.
Thank you very much.